I got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. Cocaine quarter piece, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA. I got hustle, though ambition, flow inside my DNA. I was born like this, immaculate conception. I transform like this, perform like this. Was Yaoshu a new weapon? I don't contemplate, I meditate, then off your fucking head. This that puts the kids to bed. This that I got.
We're gonna skate to one song only.
The fans is watching, niggas plotting to get me. Will I survive? Will I die? Come on, let's picture the possibility. Giving me charges, lawyers making a grip. I told the judge I was race wrong, and that's why I blake shit. Was hyper as a kid, as a teenager. On my mobile calling big shots. On the seen me major, packing hundreds in my drawers. Fuck the law, bitches, I fuck with a passion. I'm living rough and raw. Catching cases at a fast rate, rolling in the fast lane. Hustle till the morning, never stop until the cash came. Live my life as a thug, nigga, until the day I die. Live my life as a boss player, cause even
I'm all the way up. I'm all the way up. I'm all the way up. Nothing can stop me. I'm all the way up. All the way up. All the way up. All the way up. I'm all the way up. All the way up. I'm all the way up. Nothing can stop me. I'm all the way up.
My swag, my flow, I stole it back. They mad, too bad, my shows is packed. My town, my crown, I really rap. I'm home, my throne, I spoil you. When the bitch was gone, they was really playing with it. I was sitting listening like they ain't even saying shit. Now the real is back, I see they all trying to change this shit. But it's really too late now, I'm going back. One of these bitches, two of these bitches gotta die. Three of these bitches, four of these bitches gonna cry. Five of these bitches popping pills, they high. Six bird bitches, none of them get fly. See, I don't wanna hear about your records and big numbers, cause I was up top 7 winners and 6 summers. All on that bus, locked me all the way down. Now I'm all the way.
Just waking up in the morning and to be well. Quite honest with you, I ain't really sleep well. You ever feel like your train of thought's been derailed? That's when you press on, lean in. Half the population just waiting to see me fail. Yeah, right, you better off trying to free hell. Some of us do it for the females, and others do it for the reeds. But I do it for the kids, life through the time we're in on. Every time you fall, it's only making me chin strong. And I'll be in the corner like, yeah, baby, till the end. And when you hear me strong from that big lady, until the referee rings the bell, until both your eyes start to swell, until the crowd goes on. What we gonna do, y'all? Give him the
If I stay with you, if I'm choosing wrong, I don't care at all. If I'm losing now, but I'm winning late, that's all I want. Now we need some space, cause I feel for you and I wanna change. Growing up alone, it seems so short, I can't explain. Whatever happens in the future, trust in destiny. Don't try to make
Every year, over 100 million people in America come in contact with the criminal justice system. A system that has executed innocent people. A system that regularly convicts the wrong one. A system where it is not uncommon that a person would be sentenced to prison for much longer than what is deserved. Once in prison, the nightmare doesn't end. America's prisons are a cesspool of violence and maladaptive behavior. America's prisons, instead of correcting the problem, often creates it. America has had enough. The people are speaking out against this. My name is Dean DiPiero. I have over 20 years' experience working in the criminal justice system. Much of my experience was gained while I myself was an inmate. Thank you for coming here. In this hour, we are going to explore the topics that matter to wrongful convictions. We're going to interview the important people involved in this movement. And we're also going to laugh. Because sometimes that's all you can do. I would like to address somewhat of a housekeeping matter for my monologue this week. Something really sad happened here at DiPiero Consultants a little over a week ago, in that I had to let a few ladies go, and this was hard because we work so close together at my company that when one has to go, it always hurts. And here, this was a few of them, and they were all in their own way somewhat decent employees otherwise, but this issue happened dealing with accountability, and as I say, I had to let them go. And unbeknownst to me, among them was what I call a terrorist typer. Yes, this is a person who gets a hold of a keyboard, and with this keyboard, they can wreak havoc on your life if they do not let the truth or the law get in the way. They could just simply cause you a great deal of consternation, anguish and suffering, which certainly describes what I have gone through. And I've got to tell you, only I have this kind of luck, okay? Where I would be wrongfully accused on a wrongful conviction group of Facebook. Fortunately, the matter by the administrator of that page was taken care of, and the person was warned that any further libelous behavior will result in removal from the group. But you know, it really got me thinking about this whole condition right now that we have in our wrongful conviction groups. And I asked you to really analyze it. You know, just as things are changing with our society and you're seeing protests and you are really seeing things kind of, at least attention, right? Attention is being drawn. I think we need to do the same thing. I think we need to do a little bit better at drawing attention so that people get out. What are we doing, my friends, if people aren't getting out of prison? What are we doing? It's good to support them, and it's good to be. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about the one thing and how a prisoner should serve his time. And it's true that a prison sentence can be a great thing for a person. For me, it was a wonderful thing. I needed that. I needed that 20-year sentence. I went in there and became a man. And I emerged a talented person who has been doing this type of work for 3 years now. So, you know, I'm not saying that prison is all bad. I'm not certainly saying that. But I was guilty of the thing that I did. And that story would not look the same had I been innocent. And so, you know, we come to Facebook in these groups, right? We look for these groups dealing with the wrongfully convicted, and we sign up. And what's our expectation? Because a lot of people are becoming really disillusioned and becoming upset. As I'll mention a couple times, a couple soft-spoken ladies I know speaking out against their groups. What are we doing? What are we doing? Nothing is improving. We're not really, as a group, as a whole, speaking of the entire wrongful conviction demographic, we're not doing anything. Now we are, me and my group, we've won 6 cases this year. We are doing something. But what we do, though, it involves more than each one of these things. I think that's the thing that people need to understand. That just as the case didn't happen on Facebook, it's not going to be resolved on Facebook. That's not the only place that you can change a prison sentence is in a courtroom. So ultimately, you have to go to court. What you need to do is use your petitions that people are signing and all of your other efforts. You need to combine those with litigation. If you don't combine those with litigation, you could have every person on the planet, literally, including the judge who sentenced him, himself, sign the petition. And still, your loved one won't get out. Until you go to court and today we are going to cover the news as we so with me here, what do you have for our first story?
Our first story comes to us from deathpenaltyinfo.org, and it's titled 2019 Exoneration Report. Official misconduct and perjury remain leading causes of wrongful homicide convictions. In 2019 alone, 143 men and women were exonerated. More than half of those were convicted for homicide, and 3 of those were actually sentenced to death. Perjury and false accusations were present in 101 of the 143 exonerations. 101 of the 143 exonerations were perjury and false accusations.
That is really something, and I would really want you, audience, think about this. That means that over 100 times out of less than 150 times, okay, so that means 2/3 of the time that someone is wrongfully convicted. And what happens is that's because somebody got on the stand and sworn on penalty of perjury to be telling the truth, only to then go on to lie. The jury believes the liar, the jury disbelieves the innocent until proven guilty, and then the innocent goes to prison. That's how that happened over 100 times. And it gets worse. You know, these are the times that we know about. This doesn't mean that it just happened this many times. If it happens 100 times we know about, then it probably happens thousands of times. What is our second story, Jen?
Our second story comes to us from NewEnglandInnocence.org, and it talks about the leading causes of wrongful convictions. Number 1 is eyewitness misidentification is the leading cause of wrongful convictions in the U.S. Over 75% of DNA exoneration cases were based on misidentification. Number 2, unvalidated forensic science. Number 3, false confessions. You think people won't confess to something they haven't done? Wrong. Number 4, jailhouse informant testimony. Number 5, predatorial misconduct. Number 6, poor defense attorney. And number 7, systemic racism and implicit bias. Not just with jury or with the prosecutor, but all the judge.
What that is, all the things, the ways that someone can be wrongfully convicted. And I'm familiar with many on lists. I think the case I worked on, I'm familiar with the eyewitness testimony. It really is shocking that in fact, their Supreme Court cases say that when someone gets on the stand, swears under the penalty of perjury, extend their finger and says, he's the guy I saw do it. That is very, very believable. When it's an old lady or when it's someone who isn't going to gain anything from their testimony, or especially if they would be hurt by their testimony. But what happened is when the advent of DNA, that actually led to the discovery that eyewitness testimony is not reliable at all. And so they started studying it. Do you know some fascinating things? Do you know if you're trying to identify someone who's a different race, you have more of a chance that you're going to get it wrong? Or how about this? It's called post-event information. Suppose you and I are watching something, say a fight break out, and after the fight, I say to you, hey, did you see the knife in his hand? Do you know that your brain will put a knife into his hand and that they can give you the polygraph test and you would likely pass it because you know your stuff? So these are things to really, really keep in mind when we're talking about wrongful convictions. And then, of course, how can I talk about false confessions without talking about Chris Tapp? Chris is a very dear friend of mine. He's someone who served over 20 years for a rape and a murder that he did not commit, but yet one that he confessed to. This happens. How does it happen? Well, they tell you, they don't say confess. They say, hey, look, we know you were there on that night. Just admit that you were there and we'll let you go home. And they say that after 12 hours and no food and no water. And guess what? You're ready to go home and you'll admit to anything but murder. So then they take up these little tiny confessions. They're not much in and of themselves, but when you string them all together, they make for a confession to murder. In Chris's case, rape as well. But he never really confessed to that. They called it a confession. The jury believed it as a confession, but it was coerced and extorted out of the person. That's the problem with these things. And Jen, what else do you have?
Last comes from the New York Times. A leading cause for wrongful convictions, experts overstating forensic results. In 2018, over 150 men and women were exonerated. Combined, they spent more than 1,600 years in prison. What was the leading culprit? Official misconduct. But another leading cause was misleading forensic evidence. hair analysis, bite marks, DNA. What the article brings out is that it's not controlled, it's not supervised. Anything's allowed to be presented and made to sound like it's factual. That's one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions in the United States.
Well, yeah, and you think about it, there's nothing more damaging if you think about it, that's getting up there and saying that from a scientific perspective, you know, he or she is convinced that this is the person. That is evidence. It's extremely damning and hard to overcome.
Very hard.
I'll tell you this. In other contexts, you kind of have a similar thing. For example, in federal litigation, I have dealt with drug cases where the same agent who is the case agent to put the defendant away is crowned as an expert, elevated to this high esteemed position, only to then give the expert testimony that the guy's guilty, is essentially what they say. Yeah, the expert status is something that is abused by prosecutors, and then when it's backed up by junk science, as is revealed and so often with these wrongful convictions, then yeah, you have a recipe for a wrongful conviction. It's great that we're talking about these stories and we're bringing light to them. That is really, really good. That's what we do here at Injustice Talks. We bring light to these stories because that's what exactly needs to happen. We need to know about this stuff. Why? So that when someone is in court, and just because they have an expert on the stand who can talk about DNA, get a second opinion. Don't stop there. Just because someone's talking, what's the saying? A pair of lips can say anything, even if it's a pair of expert lips. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us at Injustice Talks. We can't wait to have you back next week.
Thank you, Dean. I look forward to it.
I am here with a very special guest who is, you meet people and you have things in common with them. Well, there are some differences in between me and my guest, but the similarities are so stark that I can call him my brother. Khalifa was a federal inmate and he was the recipient of an injustice, but he really didn't know it until he started studying the law himself, and he picked it up. And he became pretty good at it, so good that he was able to gain for himself a release. Now this, of course, coming from a person who probably, as we'll find out, probably didn't have a Juris Doctor's degree when he was arrested, nor did he have any legal training whatsoever. But, you know, they say the necessity is the mother of invention. So we're going to hear this story, and I know you're going to love it. Khalifa, thank you so much for being on Injustice Talks. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, sir. Thank you for letting me have a chance to express myself.
Now, you know, I would love to just jump right to the law library, but let's tell the whole story. So before the federal government came into your life, who were you? Who were you as a young guy, and who did you become as a young adult when this thing started?
I was a young suburbanite, college student, activist, brand new anarchist to the movement, worked with Food Not Bombs, Earth First, wanting to change the world and undo all the injustices that I perceived at around 17 to 19 years old.
Wow, isn't that something? That really is something that you would have that in your heart, and then of course as your life would take its turn of events, you would get on the job training. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what it was that put you in prison, and then of course your heroic release. When we come back, you're watching Injustice Talks. All right, so let's take it back now to that fateful time. If you could describe for us what it was that you were arrested for, how you were arrested, give us the circumstances, and really take us back factually and what happened. And remember, not all of us are lawyers, so try to take it easy on us here, okay?
Right. Without the law, what we had is an art collective with a bunch of individuals, all college educated, mostly middle class, upper middle class, anywhere within our 20s to 30s. And we purposely chose to do civil disobedience and work in the adult entertainment industry to cross that line with high-end escorting. And with that, we were attacking two different things that we perceived to be authoritarian. And that was the morality against, we'll just say, a liberated sex or alternative sex life, as well as what two consenting adults do, just say the legalization of prostitution. So these were two core things that we put together. Relationships, a lot of things were in there, and these ideas. We created websites. People that they had their own websites. Some actually knew the video industry. They have their own filmography. We ended up being a media studio of our PR firm, and it doing 70s national distribution deal with Sugar DVD, and all these DVDs were very alternative. Meaning go to protest and really protest, create documentaries. We would put together 30-minute, cut that up in segments, and then throughout our travel out the nation, we collect sections that were done with talent, and we would put that in with our documentary, and we'd package that up. And that's what we're doing. Then we could get some attention, thinking that we could maybe get some influence, be a part of the conversation for issues that. So what we were doing, and we did for 10 years, got right up, contacted film festivals, things pretty well. Fast forward, I moved to Vegas for 4.5 years, back to Tennessee. When I got to Tennessee, this pandemic called the opioid, real. And what happened, like everybody that was eating my business or working with me, wasn't so much for the cause of the philosophy. It was the very high amount of money in a very short amount of time, so that they could take care of various habits. And that's what happened for about a year and a half. Ended up, and that's what they cared about. We had no relationship on their own. Institution sting. They elected to do a video interview to voice how the escort agency or what it is I did, information they knew about me, and 30 minutes into the interview, after they told everything, the detective asked him, "Is he selling drugs? Is he selling drugs?" I said, "No, he doesn't sell." So after all that happened, they asked this individual, he said, "You dating him?" He says, "No, I'm not dating him. He lies a lot. He asked me this one time," and she said some other things, and they calmed it. And one of the detectives jumped in and said, "Well, do you feel like you're forced to be here tonight?" She said, "No, I made a bad choice, and it's not to live with." The other detective jumped and said, whoa, we don't mean to be. We see also, victims. And she said, "Okay, I understand." And the other detective jumped right in and asked the same question. "Do you feel like may come here tonight?" She called him. She said, "Yes, I'm forced every time." And they asked her how she's forced. She said, "Either break legs and kill my family." This is a 7-year-old Marine in prison and been arrested for trafficking heroin, which got them out of the Marines. So it went from a promotion prosecution, even though I wasn't there, charged, I guess they were probably charged with, to now the federal law that says use force, fraud, or coercion to cause someone to enter into engagement into the commercial sex act.
Now, let me ask you this. The issue that ultimately gained you a release, who was it that found that issue? Who was the first person to spot it?
I'd have to say me. I was working on other people's cases, and I currently only had a motion in about some jail credit with my plea agreement that they had owed me, and it was not being applied correctly. And I'd already won the first motion because it was not applied correctly. And then even still, once they corrected it, still wasn't applied correctly. So that's kind of what we're here. And then after it took so long, I started appeal. But during that period while I was waiting, a year and a half, I was working other people's cases. I kept seeing this phenomenon with these cases. And you'll recognize that the average people in the feds that go out, give them 5%, 6% that might actually go to trial. And that's overall. Human trafficking, the average go to trial is 50%. And we have to ask, what is that? It is because 50 individuals believe when they hear law, they hear it react to them, they say, "I do that. I would force someone to do anything they want to." And say, and play all the time, they're 50 years to life for a trial. And they lose every single time. And in working on those cases, I began seeing something. I began synthesis, this semantic play with words, to where actually saying handle pimping.
Against Life by Dean DePiero is sure to win its prize. Readers have reported to losing 25 pounds just the first 2 hours reading this book. Others reported coming out of debt before the book. Marriages are being restored, peace is being brought in the Middle East. And people are stopping to riot just to continue reading Against the Odds in Life and Law by Dean DePiero. Look, there are books that come and go. But then there are other books like the Bible and well, Against the Odds in Life and Law. Do you want to lose weight? Do you want to come out of debt? Do you want to restore your marriage? Then be sure to pick up a copy of Against the Odds in Life and Law. So says every world leader and God himself.
In addition to becoming a successful litigant while in prison, Khalifa also wrote a book. If you would, Khalifa, tell us, what was the inspiration behind the book? What was it like writing a book in prison? And tell us, of course, about the book itself.
Right. Well, the book is titled Sex and Magic, Human Trafficking on Trial. The title in and of itself is a part of my defense. Magic, in the most simplest of ways, without going too deep, is the ability, we'll just say, to bring something from thought, consciousness into the real world. And I have over decades of study with these things. And so I used the ability to persuade, to use words, to influence, to allow someone to use their free will to choose to work with me or not to work with me. To engage in something that may or may not be in the gray area of the law. It was up to them. It was all about their free will. That's all they ever used. Out of the 10 people they interviewed, the FBI interviewed, 99% of every person I spoke with, exactly what they said. Allegedly, these terms, which were rehearsed and used with the evidence, direct evidence back then, were used to charge and indict. But so that's how the book is Human Trafficking Trial. And what inspired me was the notion of the thing I felt I would do with my life, which was provide public relations, litigation, public relations to the culture, people that are being a bigger foe in that response. And when you look at big cases or high profile cases, the more media coverage you can draw a case, a lot of times it makes prosecutors do their job, defense attorneys do their job. And to be honest, people do their job and go by law. A lot of sentences.
I have a very special guest with me. This is Lisa, and I have, we know each other from Facebook. We've kind of been keeping an eye on live events. And interesting, something has happened here. So let's start by introducing you. Lisa, if you would introduce yourself and also share with the audience what is that brought you the wrongful conviction movement.
Well,
I'm here with a client as well as someone who has a story dealing with yet an aspect of wrongful convictions is dealing with supervision. Supervision have a stifling effect on your life, and the box is supposed to be to help you to become a better citizen, so that the person on supervision would gain the tools necessary to be a productive member of society. Well, what happens though when the person starts off as a productive member of society, and then through the imposition of these often crazy rules that some people can't actually live between. And what I mean by that is there are rules, for example, that prohibit the person being supervised from traveling outside a very small geographical district. Well, if you have a job and a career that requires you to transfer, then what that will mean for you is that your supervision will stop you from working. And that's exactly what it did with my guest. David Chapsky, thank you so much for being here on Injustice Talks.
Thank you, Dean. I really appreciate you having me.
Great. So now our relationship, is somewhat new, but how I meet you is actually an interesting story. And just to set it up, so you and your buddy, you're in the military, you're serving the country, and he gets in trouble and you get called to the grand jury simply because you're his friend, and the federal government doesn't like your answers. As a result of that, both you get charged for lying, is what they said you did. You maintained your innocence. You went to trial. Meanwhile, your friend, he ended up doing a little bit of prison time. That's where I meet him. I help him get him off supervision. That's where you and I meet. I would like you to start, David, by describing your life before supervision compared to and in contrast to what it was like on supervision.
Well, prior to supervision, I was making in the about $150,000 a year. Had a very successful career and had great family life. Everything was going quite well. Then, of course, the grand jury came, and I believed that I was telling the truth. And then they did not like some of my answers, and some of the answers I proved that I guess I was wrong, but I wasn't aware that I was wrong. But we ended up going to trial, and I was found guilty on one of the 2 counts of perjury before a grand jury.
One of the 2 counts of telling a lie. And then for that, you were sentenced to supervision. And you mentioned the great income that you were able to get prior to supervision. What were you doing prior to supervision that allowed you to earn that kind of income?
I was working for the government.
Okay. And of course, a felony conviction, as everyone knows, a felony conviction will quickly take away that job. But you're resourceful and you have other trades. So if I understood, a position in trucking was available to you, and something that you could have done, but because of the conditions of supervision, you couldn't do that, right? Could you explain that for people who wouldn't quite understand how that could even be possible? Could you explain that?
Yes, sir. When one of my MOSs, or military occupational specialties, was truck driving. Also, I had a Class A commercial driver's license at one point. I had asked my probation officer if I would be able to engage in that type of business, because that they do make a decent wage, but because of the fact that I would have had to leave the district, and I do live so close to the edge of the district that it's not very difficult for me to have to leave the district in going in just a short distance. But because of that, it precluded me the opportunity to find gainful employment.
Yeah, and instead, as the story unfolds, and we don't have to divulge much because we are talking about your personal life, but you end up getting a job that is not sufficient, and you have a sizable family, right? You're trying to support yourself, and you have kids, correct? You have kids, correct?
Yes, I do.
May I ask how many?
I had 3 sons. One has passed away.
Wow. Okay, so there you have a big family, and now you're working a job that cannot pay it, and then the story gets worse, where you actually end up getting on government assistance, and that's insane. Had you ever been on government assistance before, David?
Never. I'd always been a very charitable taxpayer, having paid quite a bit in taxes. Never had a need or use for public assistance.
Wow. Well, but then supervision gets a hold of you, and that's why I've entitled this, persecution by supervision, because this was the type of supervision that really truly persecuted you in the terms of it affected your family life, it affected your livelihood, it really touched every aspect of your life, and that is when you and I meet. And I'm very, very happy to report to the audience that he's not on supervision today. Is that correct, David? You're not now, are you?
Not at all.
That is,
I am off of supervision. I was able to get off, I believe it was the 18th of last month.
The 18th of last month, that was a motion that we did where we brought all this to light to the judge. the way that the supervision was affecting him and his family, and in a grander scheme, society as well, right? David doesn't need to be on that should be given to the people who actually need it. And David would not need it if it weren't for supervision. So as he's trying to rebuild his life, but yet there's another aspect to the story, and we're going to get to that when we come back. Thank you so much for staying with us. I am interviewing David Chapsky, a client and also someone who really was put through the ringer on supervision as we're learning. And then yet the story, as if it could, it does get worse. You see, as you heard, David served in the military, and he was also an avid gun collector. He of course used them responsibly. He collected them, and as you know, the guns could be worth quite a bit of money, especially if you have antique guns or special guns. Well, David had collected many firearms throughout his time, and he was allowed, of course, to possess them and own them as just a citizen. He had that right. Well, guess what happened? As soon as he was convicted and on supervision, though he is no threat to anyone, along comes the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. And they come to David's house, and there's something they want. What? All of his guns. All of his guns. And without a warrant or without any due process whatsoever, they come in and they steal his guns. They don't even, this isn't even a story of conversion. And this is to the lawyers who are with me, right? This isn't conversion. Conversion is when they take it legally and then they retain it illegally. That's not what happened here. Without a warrant or without forfeiture proceedings or any ensuing forfeiture proceedings, legal that is, this was not a crime that had anything to do with guns. So in the part that really kind of sticks out on the human aspect is that these were guns. This was property of David's that he could have liquidated to help his family. David, talk about that if you can.
Yes, Dean. It was about September of last year, 2019. Two agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had come to our home in West Virginia and had requested to take possession of firearms. And the firearms were not in my possession because of my felony conviction. I was not allowed to have them, nor were they allowed to be in the home. As a decision by the court and the probation office, it was agreed to that my firearms would be retained in my wife's possession in a separate storage facility. So my wife took out, she leased a storage facility that was about $40 a month, and those weapons were secured inside of there, away from my possession. I had no access to them. She knew the code, and she had the keys to be able to get into it. Well, ATF showed up and said that I couldn't have them, and neither could she. So they seized them, and I was an avid collector, and the weapons that I did have were known as NFA weapons, National Firearms Act, and that generally deals with machine guns and silencers and things like that, things that have generally a high dollar value. So they took possession of those weapons. They did tell me that they were just going to hold on to them until they could be disposed of. Well, that did not turn out to be the truth, because shortly thereafter I received a letter from the ATF's asset forfeiture office telling me that that they were going to seize my weapons, and that I had to that I was illegally in possession of them, and that's why they were seizing them. So I had to go through a process to try to appeal that, and I brought to their attention that I was not in possession, and that the court had ordered my wife to maintain these weapons. Well, it did not matter to the ATF's asset forfeiture, and they sent me back a letter saying that they were considering the matter closed and that they were seizing these weapons.
Wow. Wow. Well, that's not the, fortunately, they don't have the final word. The courts have the final word, and that's what's next for us. You and I, David, together, you representing yourself, me helping you, we were able to bring justice to the supervision situation. And now what we're going to attempt to do is maybe not get the guns back, not necessarily. This isn't about guns, you understand. David can't have guns. I want you to understand that. It's not that David has a right to have guns. He can't, as a matter of fact, now that he's a felon, unless President Trump pardons him, he's not going to be able to possess a firearm. So he doesn't want to go to prison, and that's not why he wants them. Why he wants them is the same reason why you'd want your car back if someone stole it, is because it's his and it has value, and he could benefit off the firearms by selling them to other responsible firearm dealers, perhaps other, just because you're hearing firearms, don't get alarmed. These are responsible people we're talking about. The question here in this is, how do you feel about the government just coming into your house and taking your stuff? That's the question. Without due process, without giving you the opportunity to defend your right to your life, liberty, or property, says the due process clause. And David was robbed of that. And that is an injustice. And that is why we are talking about it. So, David, I want to thank you so much for coming on to Injustice Talks, for sharing your story, and for letting us be a part of it. We will, of course, be talking a lot more about your case as we try to get people involved. As you're watching this right now, please message us. Let us know, is this a case that you think is worth getting involved in? Is it worth getting involved in a case where the government comes in and steals a private citizen's stuff? Let me know. We want to hear your comments. And until then, David, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to having you back after we win the next matter.
Dean, I do really appreciate your help, and without you, there's no way I could have gotten off probation. I would still be on probation to this day, having to deal with random drug tests and having probation officers show up to my house and terrify my children and my wife. So thank you. God bless you.
Thank you so much, David. Here at Injustice Talks, me and my team, we're all about fixing these things. It's unfortunate we can't fix all of them, and we're halfway there with you, my friend. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Back, and I am here with yet another David, but this is an equally tragic story. I mean, imagine, if you will, that your first romance, the first romance that you have in your life, has such an effect on you that you are forever debilitated. You are forever to wear the worst scarlet letter that you really can wear in our society today, and that is to be branded as a sex offender. I can actually, with my experience being in prison, as I have been for 23 years of my life, and also seeing how society is to sex offenders, I can tell you that I would rather be nothing else. I would rather be anything else than to be a registered sex offender, for the way that we look at sex offenders. And sometimes it's justified, of course, but sometimes it's not. And that's what this story is about. And I therefore want to introduce my guests. Go ahead, if you would, David, introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Chapman. I'm currently on the sex offender registry and have been for 32 years, since I was 17 years old. I initially had my first romantic experience with a girlfriend at the time. Her name was Debbie, just a couple years younger than me. And I was sentenced to prison for a total of 5 years at that point for second-degree sexual assault for having had consensual sexual intercourse with her.
And what state did this all occur in, David?
Missouri in 1987.
In Missouri of 1987, and of course, things were different. But in this regard, I don't know how much different there is, because just the, as we would call it, the static facts of the case. We have David here who's under 18, albeit he is 17 years old, and he is with a girl who is a couple years younger than him. And it really is quite an anomaly, isn't it not, that they're both juveniles, right? So, as the law would evolve later on, specifically in relation to giving people life without parole sentences for things they do as juveniles, that's now considered unconstitutional. And the reason why that's unconstitutional is we know that juveniles, I'd say more so male than female, not the other way around, are prone to make irrational, bad choices, and we don't give them life sentences. It's ironic that we don't give them life sentences, but that is exactly what you got, David. You got a life sentence for something you did as a juvenile, which itself is of course a violation of the 8th Amendment, and we'll talk about that for a second. But if you would share with the audience, and please, I don't mean to offend you for speaking it like this, but what is it like to live the life of a sex offender, even though you were a juvenile, but now because the government has placed this registry on you, you are now a sex offender, whether you are or not. That's the problem. And I would like you to share with the audience, what is it like to live as a sex offender, both in prison and outside of prison?
Well, at the age of 17, it's pretty traumatic. To be honest, I messed up some probation that I initially had. Actually went to prison at 19 for the sexual assault. I was very traumatic to begin with. Young person as a sex offender in prison. They don't get as much protection from the older guys as you would think. I was a little cuter back then. So I had a lot of sexual abuse, a lot of physical abuse, a lot of time spent in lockdown over the years of that time. I eventually did 12 years in prison. The rest of the time I did in Arkansas for other crimes. But in Missouri, the 5 years was a real literal hell. I was in and out a couple of times. The inability to function properly out in society came pretty quick, and the ability to become a better criminal intensified, so I started getting in more trouble after I finally did get out. Outside, it's been, the only word I can think of it is just plain ridiculous. I was eligible to get off the registry at any time after 10 years at that point. For whatever reason, because I got lost in the system, because nobody really cares at all. I've been on it now 32 years. I'm in Portland, Oregon now, which is one of the most liberal states in the country. And one of the main reasons I came here is because it's not that bad for a sex offender. Basically, I go in once a year, re-register. I have to register if I move, if I go to school, or on my birthday. Other than that, if I don't get in trouble, they don't really mess with you much. But being able to get a job, you have to put on there that you're a sex offender. Be able to get housing, they find out that you're a sex offender. Anywhere within 1,000 feet of a school, you can't live. And if anybody looks on maps in this country, it is really hard to find a spot where there's not a school within 1,000 feet. And that goes anywhere from elementary school to colleges. It's all included. So, I mean, I'm 50 now. I'll be 51 in February, and I've been on this thing for 32 years for something. It's just a couple of kids, goofing around, and it ended up ruining my entire life.
I can see that, and it is a completely tragic story. And I just wonder, and please, audience, chime in with your comments. We really want to hear them. This is such a sticky subject, and David knows that. He knows that more than anyone. And one question I would like to ask you, David, you say that wasn't the end of your troubles with the law.
No.
You found yourself in more trouble, but did you ever find yourself with another sex offense?
No, never. No, I became more antisocial. It's hard to really explain. I just stopped caring, I became more violent. I became more just criminally oriented, I gave up. I was like, well, you're just going to do this to me. Why should I care? Luckily that's changed. I've been out of prison now 12 years. I've managed to get bachelor degrees in criminal justice and sociology. I've been clean and sober 12 years. So I've effectively turned my life around in every way that they want me to. But now this is the last hurdle, and it's a monumental hurdle, and it is completely stopping the race altogether.
And we are going to talk about that when we come back, about how this is affecting your life and about what people can do to help you, because that's what it's all about. It's all about community, and it's all about us getting behind these stories where there is an injustice happening. Sometimes these stories don't necessarily call for action. Sometimes we just want to bring them to your attention, because these things have a tendency of repeating themselves, and knowledge is power, right? We protect ourselves with knowledge. So that's why Injustice Talks, because it's through the talking of these things that you people can prevent yourselves from happening to you. If you're 17 years old and you're listening to this, then hopefully this is a story that you can learn from. This is not you, right? You don't want this to be you if you're 17 years old right now. You don't want to be a 50-year-old man, not being able to live wherever you want to live, having to let everyone know about your first time having sex. Something so private, something so special is turned into the biggest Achilles heel of your life. We're going to talk about how we could possibly help David in this situation to become who he really is. And that's not a sex offender. That's a law-abiding citizen. We'll be right back. Thank you so much, and welcome back. We are in this interview where we are learning what it is like when you are a victim of circumstance in your first sexual encounter. Imagine that you're a teenager, you're 17 years old, you're on the cusp of becoming an adult, and here you are to discover what sex is like. I was 16 myself. But 17, imagine it, if you will. And the girl who you are to lose your virginity with, who she is also going to lose hers with you, she is just 2 years younger than you. And you have sex with her, and guess what? You're a sex offender now. Yeah. And let's fast forward the tape now, and now you're 50 years old. And that is our guest. This is an amazing story. I would like to ask you, David, if you could describe the ways how this is affecting you today, because I want to set it up and to really just be honest and say, because some people may be thinking, you know what, you've already learned how to live with this. People can come to terms with living with a life sentence. So if you would describe for us how it is that this is affecting you today, if it is.
Well, the many years I did in prison, I ended up with bipolar disorder, PTSD, major depressive disorder, antisocial personality disorder. So I don't have the mechanisms to function in society. they're not there. As much as I want to, as much as I try, you know, it's just a daily struggle to do what everybody else finds to be normal. And so I have a lot of emotional, mental health issues I deal with. I was married twice, divorced twice, have 2 kids from those marriages, lost all opportunities with those because I don't know how to have relationships. I've been out of prison this time 12 years, and I don't do relationships anymore. If it weren't for my service animal, Tootie, I would have nobody at all. You know, it's lucky if I have anybody that talks to me at all any day. You know, I have to go out and make efforts to have any communication at all. I have been homeless for the last 4 years here in Portland, specifically because the first job I got hired me knowing my criminal background, transferred me to North Carolina. A week after I got there, they fired me for the same criminal background check involving the sex offense, and then moved me back here after I sold everything I had here to the streets, and I've been on these streets ever since. It's hard to find work. The only jobs I can manage to find are yard work jobs on Craigslist, and that's maybe, if I'm lucky, $100 a month. I live in tents or just a sleeping bag if I'm not lucky enough to have a tent. Right now, I am very grateful that I'm being helped with an organization that's putting me in a hotel for about a couple months now, and we're trying to help get me housing. But I mean, overall, the ability to function as a normal person, it's just not there.
I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, you know, we talk about injustice, and, you know, we talk about the many faces of injustice. And, you know, we get so used to the you know, the typical story of the, you know, the guy on death row and DNA comes and saves him, like the John Grisham books I loved in prison, you know. But in reality, injustice takes so many different forms. And look at the real effects that injustice takes on a life. This is a human being who has been struggling for 32 years because of a misclassification that was placed upon him that put him in a category of lepers. Our society looks at sex offenders as lepers. Maybe no one will say it. I will. That's how we look at sex offenders. And when we put that label on someone who was merely having sex with a like-aged teenager, then I believe that that is an injustice. Now, if we're going to wait for our system to recognize what it did to David, then we're going to wait a long, long time. That is why we need you. We need your help. That is why we bring these stories to you, so that you would consider. Do you feel moved by this story? I mean, you watch these stories, you read the stories, but do you really help? This guy needs help. David needs help. Why? Because we have a broken criminal justice system, and it does this to lives. And when it does this to lives, it is up to us, people who do care. Would you do this to someone? I wouldn't do this to someone. We are different than the government that does this. And we therefore have the obligation and the responsibility, the communal ethical obligation to help one another. And if you feel moved, if what I'm saying touches you, if you cried with him, then won't you consider going to his GoFundMe page? He needs help in so many different ways. You could also contact him, showing you his name. Of course, I will give him the opportunity at the end to share that contact information with you. You can also contact me or anyone on my team, and we can hook you up with David, so you can help him. This is what it is all about. And I want to thank you in advance for that. I want to thank you that while so many people are just talking about this, you're really doing something. And you are on my team if that is you. Thank you so much, David, for coming onto the show. Thank you for watching Injustice Talks and for being a fan, and also for being a guest today and sharing such a personal, private thing. You are risking what by doing this? I'm sure you've been assaulted many times for this classification that you're wearing, and you may even for doing this, but you did the courageous thing and you told your story, and you did so believing that the people would hear you and they would respond. And I trust that they and that you will be the same. Thank you so much for being us.
Thank you.